And let's talk about some of the responses that you received from the academic community, of which I'm sure you, in your travels, come across many opponents of intelligent design. What has been the response to your work that you've received?
It's funny, a lot of people who aren't invested in the debate, like people, my philosophy colleagues who do ethics and history of philosophy, and they don't pay that much attention to the debate. When they hear me talk about these sorts of issues, they're like, well, yeah, of course, that's right. And in fact, some of them even say, well, isn't that just trivially true what you're saying? Isn't that just obviously true? And then I have to point out to them that there are other people, other philosophers who completely disagree with me, and they're often surprised when I point that out. So it's interesting that there are certain people who are really invested in the debate and really mad at me, but then the people who I would think are potentially more objective and more neutral on it seem to be more on my side.
And what would be an example of a point that you make where people say, well, that should be obvious, but then because you follow this debate very closely, that to some critics it's not so obvious?
One of the points I make is that science should, in principle, be able to consider supernatural hypotheses. And I mean, this point isn't obviously original with me. People like William Dembski and others, make this point. Del Ratch, who I'm a huge proponent of in terms of his philosophical abilities, he makes this point effectively. But what I do is I just start telling stories. Like, imagine and I think this story might be due to Dembski. I can't remember. I have so many different stories in my head. I don't remember the sources of them anymore. But imagine that a pulsar started flashing Morse code. And then we wrote down what the pulsar was saying. And it was saying, hey, this is a message from God. Let me tell you all these truths about the universe. If you set up this sort of novel experiment that you've never set up before, you'll get this novel result. And we start, testing this. And in fact, the pulsar seems to be telling us all these truths and predicting the future. And then it starts tells us what the true theory of religion is and all that. I think this would provide some evidence for the existence of God. Now, obviously, there are other hypotheses that we would have to consider. We could be hallucinating. It could be our scientist friends playing a trick on us. Maybe this pulsar doing what it's doing maybe wouldn't provide that strong evidence for the existence of God. But my claim is just that it would provide some evidence for the existence of God. And I think that's just a really basic, obviously true claim. But there are people out there like Robert Pennock who dispute that.
Judge Jones, in the Kitzmiller case, gave basically a 6-part test for whether intelligent design is science. And
right.
We don't have to go through each 6 parts right now, but one of the ones that was just sort of, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, was his argument that because intelligent design has allegedly been refuted, that therefore it's not science. Your response to that argument?
Yeah, that's really bad reasoning on Judge Jones's part, unfortunately. And it's not necessarily Judge Jones's fault, because the plaintiffs, the ACLU side, had people like philosophers like Robert Pennock testifying to that. And fortunately, the defendant side did not have any sort of solid philosopher of science, who was there to refute those sorts of claims. Steve Fuller was the best they had, but he's more of a sociologist of science. So if I were there, and I had heard Pennock say things like that intelligent design has been refuted by the scientific community, so it's not science, I would have pointed out that reasoning is fallacious, because there are other theories that have been refuted by the scientific community but are still scientific. Newtonian physics would be the paradigm example of that. Newtonian physics predicts that a clock at a base of a building runs at the same rate as a clock at the top of a building. And if you think back to your Newtonian perspective, you'd say, well, of course, different clocks run at the same rate regardless of where they are. But according to general relativity, clocks at bases of buildings run slow compared to clocks at tops of buildings, because clocks at bases of buildings are in stronger gravitational fields because they're closer to the Earth. Obviously, the difference is really, really minimal when we're talking about tops of buildings and bottoms of buildings. But the difference is still there, and it has been empirically confirmed. GPS, the system of satellites in the sky that we use to locate where we are on Earth, GPS would not work if we didn't take into account general relativistic effects. GPS wouldn't work if we didn't take into account these sorts of time dilation due to gravitational field effects. So Newtonian physics is just wrong. It's been refuted by the scientific community, but that doesn't make it non-science. Obviously, one could go on and try to cite other reasons that Newtonian physics is scientific while intelligent design isn't. And then we'd have to get into that debate and see what other reasons there are. But the very reason that Judge Jones focuses on, which is, well, intelligent design has been refuted by the scientific community, therefore it's not science, that line of reasoning doesn't work.
From your perspective as a philosopher who specializes in philosophy of science, how do you feel about judges who try to settle these kind of questions? I can't tell you how many students I come across who are assigned to read the Kitzmiller ruling and they just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. So how do you feel about judges that try to take these bold stands on these types of issues?
Yeah, it's really disappointing. I don't even want to judge the judges per se, because maybe they have reasons for doing what they have to do, even though I think it can be problematic. The people that I really want to judge are the philosophers who go and testify to the judges and say in court, this is the correct demarcation between science and non-science, without at all flagging that within the philosophy of science community, any sort of demarcation between science and non-science is highly contentious. Now, you might say, oh, it's not the role of that particular philosopher to flag it, maybe it's the role of the other side to flag it. I guess that gets at a really, actually, I think, a tricky and interesting question about intellectual honesty versus the role one plays in a courtroom. I personally would err on the side of intellectual honesty, but I could see, one saying, well, I'm just going to say what I think as vociferously as possible and not flag that what I'm saying is contentious and leave it, in this case, to the defense to point that out. If you actually go back and look at the transcript of Robert Pennock's testimony, if you look at the cross-examination, the lawyer cross-examining Pennock does a really bad job at one point, because the lawyer brings up Larry Loudon, who's a famous philosopher of science, who has argued that there is no good demarcation between science and non-science, or at least no one has come up with it yet, and we shouldn't try to rule things out as unscientific based on contentious demarcation criteria. And Loudon wrote a famous paper about that, and I think Loudon's view is the majority view within the scientific community. And it follows from Loudon's view that one wouldn't want to endorse methodological naturalism, the doctrine that the methodology of science can't consider supernatural hypotheses. Well, the cross-examining lawyer asks Pennock about Loudon. He says, well, what about Larry Loudon's views? And Pennock gives this multi-page long, rambly, confusing response where he basically implies that Loudon would say that methodological naturalism is a rule that science has to follow. And Loudon wouldn't say that. And then you know what the lawyer says at the end of Pennock's rambly response? He says, thank you, Your Honor, I have no further questions. And what the lawyer should have said is, but wait, Loudon actually says this and this, and aren't you misrepresenting him, Pennock, when you say this and this? And Pennock really should have been pushed on that really hard. And unfortunately, he wasn't.
I actually remember that. I was in the courtroom when Robert Pennock did his entire testimony. And I wasn't part of the trial. I was just sitting in the audience of the courtroom. But I remember that Robert Pennock gave this really long response. And, from the, lawyer's strategy, you might advise your witness, hey, if you get cornered, just wax eloquent and try to confuse the attorney and throw him off. And I think that Pennock succeeded in doing that. And I was just like, what just happened? Because what just happened was Pennock's entire house of cards crashed to the ground, and he managed to prevent anybody from noticing. I think that you are bringing up points that have been forgotten about the Kitzmiller ruling, but I think that we're probably just about out of time for this podcast. So stay tuned, listeners, for more with Professor Bradley Monton coming up on the ID of the Future podcast. Thanks for listening.